Well, good morning. Good morning. Excellent. Just want to make sure you're there. Anyway, welcome to USIP. My name is Michael Yaffe. I'm the Vice President for the Middle East and Africa program here at the USIP. And it's my honor to introduce this panel today. But before I do, let me just give you, for those who are unfamiliar with USIP, a brief background about the Institute. The Institute was founded in 1984 to be an independent national institution founded by Congress and dedicated to the proposition that a world without violent conflict is possible, practical, and essential for the U.S. and global security. We're pleased to co-host today's event on lessons of U.S. policy towards South Sudan with the Holocaust Museum's Simon-Skjodt Center on the Prevention of Genocide. For those joining us via webcast and following us on Twitter, please feel free to join the conversation and ask questions by using the following #SouthSudanLessons. I would also like to extend a special welcome to our distinguished guests and to, in particular, former ambassador to South Sudan, Molly Fee, who was with us today. USIP has a long history of work in South Sudan. Our current programming aims to promote inclusive and durable peace processes produced by our research and analysis, strengthened by the capacity of local peace builders through training and network building, and by convening and advising high-level decision-making on options on peace. Last week, USIP hosted Senator Jeff Merkley, who shared his reflections on his recent trip to South Sudan and the impact of the devastating ongoing food crisis there that has left over half the population in need of food aid. South Sudan has been a bipartisan issue in Congress and a priority for many of the champions in Africa and on Capitol Hill. South Sudan currently finds itself in a critical juncture. Nearly 5 years of conflict have left a devastating impact on South Sudan citizens. Fighting continues throughout much of the country despite attempts to implement a peace agreement in 2015 and several subsequent ceasefires. A series of recent peace talks mediated by regional leaders that began at the end of June have failed to produce an inclusive and sustainable peace agreement. And the UN Security Council approved a U.S.-drafted resolution just last Friday that imposed an arms embargo and travel ban and asset freeze against several key South Sudanese officials. So how did we get here? This is an important moment in the international community to pause and reflect on the lessons from international policy towards South Sudan in the years leading up to and during the Civil War. We are fortunate to have here today with us an old friend and former colleague at USIP, John Tenham, who has authored a new report published by the center, the Simon-Skjodt Center, that is, titled From Independence to Civil War, Atrocity Prevention, and U.S. Policy Towards South Sudan. John currently serves as a visiting fellow at the Simon-Skjodt Center and as African Director at Freedom House. You will hear from John in just a few moments as he shares his insights and a short summary and the main findings from his report. We're also pleased to have here today a panel of distinguished experts. We are joined by Ambassador Don Bluth, former U.S. Special Envoy for Sudan and South Sudan, Kate Almquist Knopf, Director of the Africa Center for Strategic Studies at the National Defense University, Joshua Meservey, Senior Policy Analyst for Africa and the Middle East at the Heritage Foundation. We're also grateful to Ali Verji, visiting expert here at USIP, who has agreed to take on the role of moderator in place of Ambassador Princeton Lyman, who is sorry he was not able to join us today. USIP has benefited during the last 5 years from the wise counsel of Ambassador Lyman, former U.S. envoy to Sudan and South Sudan, and has most recently transitioned here at the USIP in his role as advisor emeritus. Today's event will begin with John's opening remarks that will serve to set the scene for the discussion. We will then be moderated on a panel discussion, followed by a Q&A session, in which we invite questions from the audience and those online. One final note about today's event. This is the first in a series of conversations. We plan to host a few subsequent discussions on South Sudanese views on what is happening in the current peace process, and also on South Sudanese perspectives on U.S. policy. And finally, we hope to host a discussion on what we have learned and what is the vision for U.S. policy going into the future. So in conclusion, thanks for joining us today, and we look forward to a productive conversation. So, John?
Thank you very much, Mike. Let me first of all say thanks, especially to the Holocaust Museum, to the Simon-Skjodt Center for the Prevention of Genocide for the fellowship and the support that went into writing this report. The folks I worked with there, some of whom are here, were instrumental in framing and helping this, and so my thanks to them. And my thanks as well to my old home at USIP here for organizing this event. It's a great chance to talk this through. I will give some brief remarks here about what I found, but I think the crux of this is in the discussion with some really excellent panelists lined up for feedback. Let me just start by saying two caveats that I think are really important that I wrote in the paper, but I want to reemphasize here. One is that doing this kind of hindsight analysis is easy, and hindsight is 20/20 compared to being in the midst of it, in the fog of war and trying to make policy. And so I very much recognize that. And anything I have to say is really in the context of trying to learn lessons and trying to inform future policy responses. Second caveat is that I worked in the previous administration from late 2014 through the end, and so I was involved to some extent in some of what's going on here. And so to the extent that there's critique or criticism, I bear some of that, I think. So what was I trying to do here? I was trying to look back on U.S. policy towards South Sudan, going back to the current war and really the run-up to it, and identify what we called pivotal periods. And so we define that as short stretches of time during which events in South Sudan compelled the U.S. to act, or in hindsight, times at which the U.S. could have acted with greater conviction but did not. And so my process was to consult informally pretty widely to try to think about what are the many, many options that could form these periods. And I had a list of 8, 10, 12 or so. And then I started these more formal interviews, which I did with about 30 people, a lot of former government officials, some current officials, and a whole slew of people, experts, academics, NGO folks who have worked on South Sudan for a long time, including several South Sudanese. And so I was doing these interviews to try to whittle down this list of pivotal periods to a manageable number, and ultimately got down to the 4 that I'll talk about today. And to try to inform myself about what lessons come out of this and what I can write about in the report. So if you have a chance to look at the report, you'll see lots of voices, lots of quotes from the people who I interviewed, and I think that's where a lot of the richness and the texture comes out. So just before I get to talking about those 4 periods, there are these 4 contextual factors that I wrote about that I think are important when we consider this. One is what I called the post-Benghazi, post-Rwanda situation, because I see these as 2, in some ways, competing impulses within policymaking in the U.S. government. By post-Rwanda, I mean the impulse to try to prevent mass atrocities. And clearly there was a sense of never again amongst people, particularly those who had been involved in the response to Rwanda. But then you have more recently Benghazi and the impetus to very understandably to try to protect American personnel and facilities at almost all costs. And that's critically important, but these 2 things are sometimes in conflict, as I think we'll see in a little bit. Second contextual factor was and is really just the long U.S. history on South Sudan, which, as we'll get into, is helpful, but can also be a little bit challenging as well. The third is the long-time hostility of the United States to Sudan in the northern Sudan, and how that plays with the relationship between the U.S. and South Sudan and the dynamic of oversimplification of bad guys in the north and good guys in the south. Obviously, that's a gross oversimplification, but it is part of what we see here. And the fourth is just the really divergent and competing senses within the U.S. government of actually how much influence and leverage there is available. And to this day, you get a huge range of people from saying that the U.S. has a great ability to influence outcomes on the ground to the U.S. has almost no ability. And there really has not been a consensus on that question. So let me jump into what I described as the four pivotal periods here. The first one comes in the spring and summer of 2013. So obviously independence in 2011, and the war started at the very end of 2013. But you start to see all these warning signs building up in the spring, summer of 2013. Increasingly autocratic behavior by President Kiir. He starts to remove some ministers and governors. He starts to reshuffle the SPLA, ultimately removing, of course, in the summer, Riek Machar and dissolving the government. And I think a lot of these warning signs were received in Washington, and I think the lights were blinking. One particularly notable instance was in the spring of 2013. There was a senior South Sudanese delegation that came here for some trade meetings, and a senior official in that delegation met with the Deputy Secretary of State and basically said, help. We're concerned about what's going on. We're concerned about the dynamics within the party. We could use some intervention. And my sense, and I wasn't there, but my sense trying to piece it together is that there wasn't really a concerted response to that request for help. And there wasn't really a concerted response from the U.S. to what were seen as these increasing warning signs. And there was a conflict, I think, within U.S. decision-making on how much do we want to own this and how engaged do we want to get. And part of that is because a lot of the problem here was within the SPLM, and the SPLM's inability to manage succession issues within their leadership. That's what so much of this comes down to. And so, but there was, I think, a real reluctance in the U.S. to get into that, to get our hands dirty within the SPLM party dynamics, in a sense of this is not our issue, we need to stay out of it. And that may well be the case. I think it's also notable that right when a lot of this was happening in the spring and summer, there was some vacancies in key positions, both at the position of U.S. Special Envoy, with Ambassador Lyman departing and Ambassador Booth coming in the early fall, and also in the Assistant Secretary of State for Africa, with Johnny Carson leaving and Linda Thomas-Greenfield coming. But for each of those, there was a 3, 4, 5 month gap or so that was harmful, I think, and that inhibited some of the U.S. response to what were these increasing warning signs. Second one is soon after the war starts and when the Ugandan army, the UPDF, intervenes. They came very quickly after the war started on December 15th, 2013. And they were greeted in a positive way in many ways in those early days, in part because they really did help to secure Juba and really did help to prevent a lot of fighting in and around Juba. And that was appreciated and that was good. But their role pretty quickly expanded too, and they pretty quickly, clearly took sides with the government and with Salva Kiir, and in many ways propped up the government. By securing Juba, they allowed the SPLA to do a lot of fighting outside of Juba. And there were also all sorts of reports about UPDF fighting itself outside of Juba in Bor and possibly further north. And Museveni himself clearly supported Salva Kiir throughout all this, and that intervention in those early days gave Uganda a foothold in this conflict that Uganda never really gave up. And Uganda and Museveni in particular have been a spoiler in the peace process all the way since, and probably are still a spoiler in the peace process to this day. And so the question is really, could the U.S. have done more, not to necessarily prevent them from coming in at all, but from limiting the Ugandan role? There are some interesting quotes in the report about whether or not the U.S. sort of approved or acquiesced to the Ugandan intervention. There's one quote saying we gave them a wink. But all that said, could we have done more to prevent the expanding role of the UPDF? And a lot of this actually gets into bigger bilateral issues between the US and Uganda, because for various reasons, I don't think South Sudan has ever been a major issue in US-Uganda dynamics. A lot of that conversation is taken up by security issues, and particularly Uganda's contributions to AMISOM in Somalia. This was also at a time when the counter-LRA efforts were ongoing, and that was a big part of US discussions. South Sudan was 4th, 5th, 6th on the talking points for senior officials when they engaged with Museveni. It doesn't have to be that way, but that is how it was, and that perhaps is a missed opportunity. Third juncture that I wrote about is concerning the arms embargo, a hot topic, of course. And of course, I was writing this before there was a US unilateral embargo, and certainly before there was a multilateral UN embargo. But early in 2014, really only days, weeks into this conflict, there was a lot of discussion, USG, elsewhere, on imposing an arms embargo on South Sudan. And in many ways, it seemed like a very logical thing to do. And there's a lot of arguments for why it would have made a lot of sense. It raises the cost of importing arms, it prevents the purchase of large weapons systems, and those large systems were quite important going forward in terms of helicopters and amphibious vehicles. It could have empowered the UN panel of experts, and above all else, it would have sent a clear message to the government, and to the opposition too. Nobody's arguing that it would have been a perfect embargo. Nobody's arguing that arms and weapons would have gotten into South Sudan. But it would have done some really positive things. And there were these arguments against it, including that it's hard to enforce, that it disproportionately harms the government, that South Sudan is a sovereign state and you don't put arms embargoes on a sovereign state, and also that this was sort of the last card to play and we have to hold it in reserve for something really meaningful. I don't think any of those arguments hold up particularly well, and I don't think history is going to judge this decision particularly well. And again, I think the signaling aspect of not having an arms embargo was hugely important. I think this was taken as a pat on the back to Salva Kiir and his government. Everybody knew that the US was the one who was holding this back, and there was pretty wide consensus in those early weeks and months on the arms embargo. And I think most people believe it could have passed the UN Security Council at that stage. Of course, late in the Obama administration, the opinions turned, and there was an effort to push through the embargo at the Security Council. At that point, dynamics have changed, and it wasn't possible then. Of course, it is possible now. One question I continue to have is why the US, if we weren't able to push it through the Council in 2016, why pursuing a unilateral embargo like the current administration did was never really considered. And I don't have a great answer for that, but that could have helped. And then the last of these junctures is, it expands in terms of time frame, but it's in the spring and summer of 2016. So we had the peace agreement signed in the fall of 2015. Even before the ink is dry, the government did what it could to pull apart the agreement, the most egregious aspect of that being the creation of 28 states on their own, which was pretty clearly a violation of agreement. Nonetheless, Riek Machar comes back to Juba after lots of discussion and back and forth in the spring of 2016. But of course, he doesn't last long. The fighting resumes, and Riek gets pushed out of Juba. And I think the evidence is clear that the government made a concerted effort to kill him, to assassinate him. This is something that still boggles my mind. I mean, Riek Machar is a killer and has a lot of blood in his hands for sure. He was also the co-signatory to a peace agreement and the first vice president of South Sudan, and the government was trying to kill him. And almost nobody said anything about that. I mean, there were some murmurs here and there, but there was no concerted statement or effort to call out the fact the government was doing this. And I still find that shocking, and I'm still confused about that, and think that's another instance of sending a very clear message to Salva Kiir and his government of tacit support for what they were doing. So Riek is gone, ultimately ends up in exile in South Africa. And then the remaining government in South Sudan pulls this sort of switcheroo by saying that the opposition, the IO, has nominated Taban Deng to be the new first vice president, and we will accept that and all will be good. And this is where I think the U.S. made some mistakes as well. Secretary John Kerry was in Nairobi in August, and he was asked if the U.S. Supports this move, and he said essentially, yes, we think it's in compliance with the peace agreement. And then a little bit later, the U.S. also said, we think REACT needs to stay out of the picture and stay in South Africa. And I think that's a 1-2 of mistakes right there. Again, REACT is no saint, but he does represent a certain constituency, and it's hard to find others who represent that constituency, and keeping him out of the picture, I think, was counterproductive. Related to that is elevating Taban, a man who has very little support on the ground, is despised by many, including in his home state. And elevating him had real consequences. It had consequences on the ground in his home state of Unity as well, in part because he was given this newfound international legitimacy, and he felt compelled to try to match that legitimacy with facts on the ground, and that was a bloody process on the ground. So the U.S. endorsement of this switcheroo, I think, did real harm, and I think the world followed this endorsement, and that is something that, in hindsight, we could have done differently. The question there is what's the counterfactual? What's the other option? This is where I think it gets into a conversation of, could the U.S. have more assertively tried to force both leaders out at this time, and was this the juncture in which to do so? I think there may have been some thinking in parts of the U.S. government that here's an opportunity to get rid of REACT, and that's a good thing, and we'll look for an opportunity to remove Salva as well. But if that was the thinking, I never saw much of a concerted effort to do that latter part. And I'm not sure there really was a concerted effort. So those are the 4 junctures that we're talking about here. There's also just these 2, what I call critical questions in the report, that are broader questions, not attached to a particular time frame, that I came across a lot that I wanted to highlight. One goes way back and asks the question of whether the comprehensive peace agreement between Sudan and later South Sudan, but then the SPLM, is to blame for a lot of what we're seeing here. And there's sort of 2 arguments to that. One is that the CPA set up the SPLM, a rebel movement, in a hegemonic position. And it sort of gave them the keys to this new South Sudan, but there was no accountability, and that led to some of the behavior that we're seeing from the SPLM that we've seen for a while now, even before independence, but that the CPA vested in them an authority that really was not deserved. And the second critique of the CPA there is that it really did very little to envision what a new independent South Sudan looks like, and you get all sorts of different opinions when the CPA was being negotiated and signed, and how likely a new independent South Sudan would be. And of course, John Garang said, I prefer a united Sudan, and so forth. The reality is that there was at least a decent likelihood that the agreement would lead to an independent South Sudan, and there's very little in the agreement about the nation-building process that would be required, or about any form of sort of international oversight mechanisms that would be needed in a new state like that, or should there have been some sort of gradual transition process along the lines of Kosovo or East Timor. None of that's in there. And even in the interim period, there wasn't a whole lot of thinking done about that. So that's one question. And the second question, I just alluded to this earlier, is was there a stage at which the U.S. should have, and U.S. partners as well, should have more aggressively sought to push Salva Kiir and Riek Machar from the scene? And it was certainly entertained within the USG, but there was never really much force put behind the idea. Some people would say that when President Obama went to the region in the summer of 2015, he was trying to get to that point. Maybe, but if that was the case, I'm not sure that was a well-cooked process. And again, if the idea in 2016 was to push Riek out and then Salva, that too was not a particularly well-cooked process. The two questions that I know U.S. government people really struggled with around this was one, how do you get the region on board, because it's not a natural thing for the region to do and for other leaders to support, and two, if not these guys, then who? And those are questions that are hard to answer, and I think continue to be hard to answer. So let me just conclude with the four concluding observations that I have in the report. And this is really where I'm trying to pull the observations and the arguments out of the South Sudan context and look for some broader applicability. The first one just concerns questioning legitimacy of leaders and even of allies when appropriate. And I think there's a very strong argument to be made for questioning the legitimacy of Salva Kiir in particular. He has never been elected the president of South Sudan. He is elected president of Southern Sudan before independence, never of this country. There were supposed to be elections in 2015. Those have been pushed off and apparently pushed off again. He is unquestionably responsible for a lot of atrocities as documented in the AU Commission of Inquiry report. There is a real basis for arguing about his legitimacy, and I think that's a conversation that needs to happen. I also think that as we look back and as we take a big picture look at U.S. policy, it's hard to avoid the fact that U.S. policy again and again favored Salva and supported Salva Kiir in this conflict. I think there was a tepid response to some of the initial fighting in Juba. There was tacit or otherwise support to the Ugandan intervention, blockage of the arms embargo, not a lot said about the violations of the peace agreement, including the 28 states, and not a lot said about the effort to assassinate Riek Machar. I would also add Salva was invited in 2014 to the Africa Leaders Summit, which I think is a questionable thing. So I just think all of this adds up to some pretty clear signaling to Salva that the U.S. was in his corner. And that may not have been the intent, and some of these individual decisions may be justifiable, but I think when you add them all up and you look at them, that's the messaging. Second, bigger picture conclusion is not to overvalue relationships. There was a lot of sentiment, I think, within the USG and probably elsewhere that we know a lot of these South Sudanese leaders, we've worked with them for so long, and those relationships will help us get somewhere. Those relationships will give us leverage, and they do not. The relationships provide access, they provide information, and that's vitally important. But the relationships are not in themselves leverage. And I think there's probably more that could have been done in order to build up that leverage and not assume that the relationships would do it. The third is always to challenge assumptions, and to do that especially when mass atrocities are involved. And particularly here, that relates to the sort of feel-good narrative of South Sudan, and it was a good narrative for some time, but it turned bad pretty quickly. And to question who our partners, who our supposed friends in South Sudan really are. And the narrative about who they are and what their interests are was simply too slow to change. I think it has changed by now, but for several years that was a pretty slow process. And related to that, I did not see a lot of instances of a really concerted effort to take a step back on U.S. policy. And again, this is sort of in the midst of the fog of war, and it's hard to do that, but in terms of some sort of red team analysis or anything like that, there wasn't a really strong effort to question our assumptions. But I think especially in instances of mass atrocities where something fundamental in a society is broken, it is all the more important to question those assumptions and to really look hard at yourself. Final point is the U.S. need to really make a decision on how invested we are in some of these instances and to stick to it. I referenced this earlier, but there was a sort of wavering within the U.S. government on how much do we want to own this problem, how much is this our problem to solve, how much do we defer to the region versus sort of take the reins ourselves and try to drive the process. And there's a lot of wavering back and forth on that, but I think that confused people sometimes. And I think there's more we could have done to reach a decision on that and to try to stick to that decision. So that's the summary. There's a lot more in the report if you have time to look at it. A lot of really interesting quotes from some people who were deeply involved in this. Look forward to a really good discussion, and I'm very open to the critique and feedback on some of what I've found. So thanks very much.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us. First, let me thank you for joining us, and indeed also to our audience online. Let me also thank our panelists for participating and be willing to participate in this discussion, and especially to John for a very valuable report, which, as you said, contains a lot more than you were able to go over now. And I do encourage everyone, if you haven't already picked up a copy, there are copies available outside. It's also available on the Holocaust Memorial Museum website. It's really a very interesting read. A couple of observations, if I may, before we turn over to the panel. One thing I hope we can come back to perhaps in the discussion is something that I think is very valuable in the report are the alternative policy options that you discuss. And in a way, it's very easy to be a critic, and I think we'd all agree, for those of us that were involved, it is easy to criticize, or much easier to criticize. It's harder to always think about alternatives. And it is perhaps useful, not only in the South Sudan context, but also beyond that, to think about what are the lessons that could be learned, what are the alternatives? Because, as you pointed out, John, a regionally initiated or a regionally mediated conflict is something that is not unique to South Sudan. Many of the conflicts in which the US has an interest in solving will be regionally mediated. There will be national interests involved, involving the neighbors and so on. The approach you've taken in terms of identifying the pivotal periods, I think, is also a really interesting and valuable one, because it does help us focus on some of the key moments. There are others, of course, as well, that we, as we discussed backstage, might also have been included. But it helps us, I think, reflect on where the relevance of these issues is for future policymakers who often are faced with a lot of imperfect choices. And it's not that there is always an apparently better option, although I think, as you pointed out, on some of the cases, the arms embargo in particular, Taban is another, perhaps it should have been clearer. And it's perhaps useful for us to think about why those choices were not made. And you expressed your bafflement at why the embargo was not pursued earlier, but I think it's useful for us to think about why is it difficult to take sometimes what seem to be the obvious right choices or the obvious better choices. And finally, I think the last point you've touched on, the limits of US agency, is also a really important point, because in terms of the respondents you had who described these extremes, either a lot of influence or a lack thereof, probably the reality is somewhere in the middle. But it's also something that's not constant. It is something that might be dynamic over time. And that, I think, is also useful for us who are interested in conflict resolution to think about how does that ebb and flow, and where can that influence be more useful at certain moments, because it isn't necessarily fixed. So again, thank you all. We're looking forward to a very useful conversation and discussion. Just a couple of housekeeping notes before we get started. When we do get to the Q&As, please identify yourself, your name and affiliation if you have one. We're also accepting online the tweets and questions, so feel free to do that. South Sudan Lessons is the hashtag. And finally, I think I want to reiterate something that both Mike said and that John said at the beginning. This is very much about trying to identify lessons. We're not necessarily saying so-and-so is at fault or anyone's to blame. So let's also just keep that in mind, because this is, as we're all very much aware, an ongoing situation where, unfortunately, there have been very tragic consequences as well. So, Ambassador Don Booth, can I turn to you first? What did you think of what John had to say and your own reflections? And we've agreed, just for the benefit of the audience, that everyone's going to have only 3 minutes, which I think is rather tough, but we'll try and see what we can do. So go ahead, Don.
Okay, thank you, Ali. First, I'd like to commend John. I think it was very well researched, and you've put a good intellectual framework together in posing the questions, the things that need to be looked at. So I agree on the 4 pivotal periods that John has identified, but I would definitely add a 5th, which was the May 2014 intervention when Secretary Kerry went to the region and got both Riek Machar and Salva Kiir to agree that they were going to focus the negotiations on a transitional government of national unity and power sharing, because that really did set the trajectory of the peace process from May 2014 on to the conclusion of the agreement in August 2015. Second, on his 2 critical questions, I agree that the CPA was partly to blame for the conflict. It definitely handed power to the non-democratic military elite. It really was to the SPLA, not to the SPLM, not to a lot of the politicians and diplomats that we engaged with more so. But the CPA itself really was between the SPLM and the government of Sudan. And so it wasn't an agreement that was really foreseeing the creation of a new state, at least certainly not from the Sudanese perspective. Perhaps from the SPLA perspective it did. But I would also posit that no one in the SPLA, SPLM in 2005 when the CPA was concluded would have had any interest at all in things like interventions from the outside, like the East Timor example, or even any type of financial controls from the outside for the new state, the type of state building things that were needed. They felt they had basically won the war rather than our perception, which is we helped negotiate the end of the war and getting them to the referendum. So there was not enough thought given to state building, but there are reasons for that. And I think we were, in the follow-up after the CPA, too concerned with getting to the referendum, getting independence on the ground after the referendum was held, and then thirdly, preventing a South Sudan war. So to another question, should we have forced Kiir and Machar to leave? I would say that we tried that, but we could not get either the regional or the international backing needed to achieve that. Perhaps we should have tried harder, but I would remind everyone that we did go to the highest levels to push that particular policy, and it did not succeed. On the key conclusions, just on one, the U.S. always sided with Kiir and the government. I would say that Salva Kiir would not agree with that. In fact, he actively tried to undermine me because he didn't like the messages that I was bringing out. Now, I guess a case could be made that the envoy was sent out to deliver one message, but the policies in Washington were sending a different signal. I don't quite agree with that, but that's certainly something that can be debated. On the invitation to the African Leaders Summit in the summer of 2014, that was very much up in the air and was very intensely debated. And the decision to invite Salva came after he agreed to reach out to Riek Machar and agreed to move forward toward a power-sharing transitional government of national unity. So that was the logic behind that. But I do agree that we definitely held back on the arms embargo for too long. Second, the U.S. overvalued personal relationships. I would argue that that's not unique to South Sudan. I think we see that repeated over and over again. And it's probably inevitable, particularly in dealing with a country that has really no institutions. It's going to be personal relationships. I agree that the U.S. saw the SPLM as the good guys, certainly during the CPA negotiations and in the run-up to the referendum and independence. But the bloom was certainly off the rose by the middle of 2013 when I took over as envoy. The actions of Salva Kiir were clearly showing that there were strains in the relationship. But another thing to keep in mind is if the SPLM was not the good guys, who were the good guys to deal with in South Sudan? They were not easy to find. The fourth thing, that the U.S. waffled on our level of investment in the peace process. And here, John, I really have to disagree with you. The U.S. was always firmly behind the IGAD peace process, which had been blessed by the African Union and supported by the United Nations. Now, when IGAD got stuck, we did indeed try to explore different ways to help. And so at one point, we had the Kerry visit, which set the direction for negotiations, and that was May of 2014. In late 2014, early 2015, we did consider whether the U.S. might go to more of a Dayton-type approach. We found that that was lacking the support necessary. It would not have been practical. But I think it gave a spur to the EGAD process. In early 2015, we were very much behind the idea of expanding to the AU5 and an expanded EGAD or African Union role, and ultimately to the EGAD Plus process. And then in July 2015, we actually had the president engaging directly with the leaders and delivering the get it done message that we were out of patience with this. So just to summarize, and I know I've gone over my 3 minutes, Ali, but I think it's important to step back from our analysis on just the South Sudan case to ask some bigger questions. One, what civil war or mass atrocity has ever been prevented by outside intervention? Two, how many civil wars or atrocities have actually been stopped via negotiations? Particularly outside of, have any of them been stopped outside of military intervention? You can think of NATO in Bosnia. You can think of Tanzania going into Uganda in 1980. But those are the only ones I could come up with. So sadly, my conclusion is that the U.S. and the international community, in quotes, we really lack both the tools, the will, and the cohesion needed to prevent or resolve civil wars in our sovereign state system. Now, that doesn't mean it isn't worthwhile looking at the lessons to be learned from South Sudan, and I look forward to that today. But really the bigger question is it possible for the international community, for the United States, to actually achieve the type of outcome that we would have liked to have seen in South Sudan? Thank you.
Thanks, Don. Josh.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, and I just want to add my commendation to Don's for John's work here. I think it's really valuable post-mortem of what went wrong. I want to draw out sort of 4 or 5 themes that struck me. I'll do it quickly, and because I think they're applicable to not only the continuing civil war, but also similar situations that we are facing now in other areas, but are going to face in the future. And Don actually touched on several of these. But the first thing that struck me was that there was an intense fixation on achieving a grand political agreement, some sort of peace deal, to the exclusion, I think, at times of stepping back and assessing whether the situation was conducive to an agreement, whether the interlocutors involved in this process were actually committed to peace. And that was, John mentioned the lack of red teaming and questioning assumptions. I think this is one of those assumptions that needed to be questioned. You can have all the political engagement and political dialogue at the highest levels that you want, but if the combatants are hell-bent on fighting, striking a deal is meaningless. And I think South Sudan has shown us that over and over again, that the international community is arm-twisted. These primarily react in salva to the table to sign something that they violated within minutes in some cases. And I would argue that there's downside, and again, John's report mentioned this, that there's damage that is done when you are involved in an agreement process or a negotiation that has no chance of succeeding. You waste time, you waste energy, you waste money, you lose credibility. The U.S. lost credibility by involving itself in pointless negotiations. The second point, again, Don alluded to this in his final points, that the U.S. has a temptation to shoehorn the centralized nation-state model onto situations where it might not be appropriate. Now, we do that for good reason. It works here in the U.S. and in most areas, but we should think much more creatively about what an acceptable, peaceful government looks like in certain places, like South Sudan, I would argue. This has never been a unified polity. Even in the midst of the Civil War with the North, some of the worst violence was intra-Southern. So in that context, is a centralized nation state really the way to go? The U.S. is just institutionally not set up to think creatively about what alternative governance models looks like. And I think we don't even consider it enough. Third, very quick point, there was an excessive focus on engaging with elites. Elites are important. You have to talk to them. You can't ignore them. But there is a very large constituency in South Sudan who's very committed to peace, and that's the South Sudanese people themselves. It's hard to talk to them, I get it, who are honest and representative leaders of the people of South Sudan. But it's doable, and there are NGOs and other organizations that talk to the South Sudanese people, civil society, et cetera, all the time. And I think there should have been greater attempts there. Again, Don alluded to this one, but humility about what is accomplishable for the United States. We do have leverage, and we should have used it better and been more aggressive at many points in this process. But I was struck by the series of blithe quotes about state building from officials. Oh, we should have pushed more for state building, this and here and there. And again, there's no assessment of the fundamentals of this region, of this country. Like, can you build a state here, at least in the way we traditionally think about building states? And does the U.S. have the power and the influence and the political will to do it? Finally, I won't belabor this point. It's obvious, and Don mentioned it. Victims aren't always the good guys. Now, there's no doubt Khartoum victimized the South, but that doesn't make the SPLA, the SPLM, the good guys.
Thank you, Josh. Kate.
Thanks, Ali, and thanks, John, for giving us this thoughtful analysis and reflection. Let me preface my comments by saying I'm one of those who maybe has been involved longest on at least the stage here since the mid-90s in the project of South Sudan. And I did have direct responsibility during the Bush administration for USAID's efforts in South Sudan. So I've reflected a lot on what's happened over the course of the trajectory of the country since the signing of the CPA and the referendum and independence, and now the descent back into civil war. And in September of 2016, I testified and tried to reflect some of the lessons that I think we missed during the interim period in the CPA, and that I think were being replicated then, and I think sadly are still being replicated today. And I hope that we don't leave the room and hear that we have yet another peace agreement that repeats some of the same mistakes. I think there are three principal tasks that we really need to focus our attention on and apply the lessons of our recent and more distant experience. And those tasks are the transition out of violence for the people of South Sudan. Fundamentally, the CPA ended Africa's longest running civil war. It did that. It was a negotiated settlement that stopped a civil war that had cost 2 million lives and over 4 million displaced. It didn't do a lot of other things, and notably, it didn't identify and lead to a political settlement within South Sudan. And we could talk a lot more about the details why that was the case. And then thirdly, it didn't lead to a productive nation state for the country of South Sudan. And our approach at the time was very technocratic, and I think thoughts around that continue to be very technocratic, and while there are important things that we can do as outsiders with assistance and know-how and capacity and political will, it's missing the point. I think there are 4 myths that I tried to identify 2 years ago now and repeatedly since then that continue to plague us today. One is that a power-sharing government can work in South Sudan. This was the fundamental framework of the CPA between the North and South, and it was replicated then in the pathway to independence for the interim government and for the newly independent government, and again in August 2015 under the current peace agreement that is now being revitalized, and we're rearranging the deck chairs once again. Power-sharing governments won't work in South Sudan. We could talk a lot more about why. Secondly, and relatedly, that Salva Kiir and Riek Machar, either one or both, can be part of the solution in South Sudan. Neither can. Neither can. We've seen this fail 2 times now spectacularly. We're about to put them back in seat for a 3rd time if this Khartoum declaration comes to fruition under the current mediation process. And it's insanity to keep repeating the same thing that hasn't worked. At truly epic costs to the people of South Sudan and to the region. And then the two other myths, or I think errors, that we continue to make is that a peacekeeping operation without a viable political settlement can actually succeed. And that ties into my fourth point, which is that other technical investments, financial bailouts, all the great things we can do with our development and conflict mitigation and assistance in support of particular aspects, those are not the solution themselves. If there's not a viable political framework and a viable political settlement, then we will never succeed just with those technocratic responses. Peacekeeping, humanitarian assistance at the moment, in different periods of time, everything we did to help stand up an interim government of Southern Sudan and then to support an independent government of South Sudan. It's that political framework that is so critically important, and where I think the most important question that we haven't grappled with satisfactorily is the legitimacy of the current regime. And that is the Achilles heel of our approach and continued policy to South Sudan. And I continue to come down on the side of the government is not legitimate. It is possible to de-recognize a government by the United States, to not treat Salva Kiir as the legitimate head of state, as John's already pointed out, and similarly not to tolerate or entertain an option that would put Riek Machar back in power. Neither one can be part of the solution here, and unless and until we come to terms with that as the United States in our policy, I don't think that we'll see a viable pathway forward. And then finally, and quickly, I do think there are alternatives. I think we've been discussing a number of them for some time, including the alternative of an external transitional administration. This is how other countries that have experienced extreme state failure and collapse have come out of their violent situation, by borrowing external competency and legitimacy where institutions and norms of oversight and checks and accountability do not exist. And this is a borrowing of it for a time until the state of South Sudan can stand on its own and serve the people the way that it's supposed to. And another alternative, and I think a related option to that, is what many South Sudanese have suggested themselves, and that's a technocratic transitional administration. And there's been a lot of excellent work done on what those options could look like, and they do exist. So I think to the red teaming point and to challenging our assumptions, it is absolutely possible to arrive at a policy in the United States that has agency over its positions, and when we draw our lines around what we're willing to support, both politically and financially with our resources and our diplomatic leverage and approach, we can change the calculus of the parties both within South Sudan and within the region, and that is what is required to get us out of the current situation.
Thank you, Kate. John, would you like to briefly respond to anything you've heard?
Only to one thing. Is this on? I just want to respond to Ambassador Booth's point that if we were favoring Salva, he didn't see it that way. And I agree. And there's a quote in the paper about how, Salva thought we were going to drone him and so forth, all these crazy fantasies that he has, and we were going to drag him to the ICC and so forth. I completely buy the idea that he didn't see it that way. And so we have this really tricky situation of, I continue to believe in actions. We were favoring him and his government. In words, we probably weren't. We were putting some strong words out there, and that's probably part of what he's reacting to, and he's probably just having his own sort of paranoid fantasies on his own. But that puts us in a really difficult place of favoring him in actions, but not being able to bring him along or to encourage him diplomatically because the bilateral relationship is broken. So I don't have a great solution to that. I agree with the point, but it's a tough place for the U.S. to be in.
Thanks, John. So before we turn to the floor, one question for the panel, just to dive into this issue of the alternatives. I mean, Don, you mentioned the arms embargo and you agreed with that. Of the 4 pivotal periods that John has identified in this report, what are your views on the alternatives that could have been pursued? And I'd like everyone to try and respond to that. And John, perhaps you can also say a bit more, at least, about one or two of them from the report. So, Kate, can I ask you to go first?
Sure. I think John identified 4 of them, and I think his paper notes that there are other candidates for pivotal periods that he could have included and were surfaced in various ways. I feel like I have a whole list of those as well. And to me, it's really a question of judgment calls when there are critical events, game-changing moments, and the U.S. response, particularly in this situation with South Sudan, because of our history, because of our role and legacy with the country, could have changed the course of events in a different way. So I don't disagree with any of the 4 that John identified. I would emphasize that I think the very first week of violence in December 2013 was an absolutely critical moment that the United States did not use the leverage I believe we did have at that moment, and could have compelled Salva Kiir to rein back, and same with Riek Machar before he launched his full-scale counter assault there. That to me was a pivotal moment. We had senior leaders in the region next door. They did not go to Juba and try and address that head on for lots of reasons, but I think that was a missed opportunity. I think, I could go through a chronology bit. I really think it's important to focus on today because this is another one of those pivotal moments. And we are on the cusp of endorsing yet another power-sharing arrangement with the same 2 leaders, fundamentally. Plus more vice presidents, and plus, inviting Sudan back into the oil fields of South Sudan. That's utter madness in terms of the history and all of the lessons that we should have learned by now for South Sudan.
Thanks, Kate. Josh, in terms of the 4 that John identified, you mentioned pointless negotiations, but beyond that, within the 4 that he's pulled out, what do you see in terms of alternatives that perhaps could have been pursued or may be worth considering?
Yeah. I think it was absolutely right to seek a political agreement and a ceasefire at the beginning of this conflict, because that should always be our first impulse, because that's the best way to have any shot at ending these. And I do think it was the early days of the conflict where we had the best chance of making a real impact. What should have happened is there was high-level engagement. There were, President Obama released a statement just, right in the early days of this conflict. But there should have been a very clear series of expectations and demands delivered from the United States in concert as much as we could with our allies in the region, and then real consequences for violating them. That's where I think is the critical point where we failed. There were a lot of statements from the NSC, from State Department, wagging the U.S. finger at the South Sudanese and saying, you bad boys better stop it, or else. And then there was just no follow-up. There was consistent flouting of the agreements. There was consistent defiance of the United States and the international community with virtually no consequences. That was where I think the South Sudanese leadership very rationally came to believe that they could pursue this war with virtual impunity, and that is how they've proceeded throughout this conflict. And I think maybe they're starting to become disabused of this notion, but I suspect on some level they still believe it. And again, I think John's report very well documents the sense among the South Sudanese leadership that they were going to have U.S. support and backing no matter what. So that gave them almost carte blanche, a blank check to do what they felt they needed to do, which in this case was pursue a vicious, brutal war.
Don.
Well, first of all, I would like to just mention that the premise of getting to a power-sharing agreement and a transitional government was based on the idea that you had to actually find a way to stop the fighting. And to get the fighting to stop, you had to get the guys who controlled the guys with the guns to get them to stop fighting. So that was what was foreseen. And we didn't have sort of rose-colored glasses on that suddenly they would all go to Juba and work together and everything would be happy ever after. The idea was that it would give enough of a pause in them killing each other that they could sit down with a broader cross-section of South Sudanese society and actually come up with a constitution or at least a political agreement on how the country might be governed in a way that they wouldn't have to continually resort to violence. Now, the lack of will was clearly there. And, when I first went out, one of the things I did, this was in December of 2013, right after the conflict began, one of the things I took with me and read was a little pamphlet from USIP that said, the rule book for mediation. And rule number 1 is don't start a mediation unless both parties are supportive of this. So that was violated from day one. But I guess the question is, what was the alternative? We had to find some way to try to stop what was a very vicious war. It was going to get more vicious because it was ethnically based. And frankly, in December and January of 2014, it was quite possible that Machar and the new air forces were going to march into Juba, and we would have seen an even much bigger massacre than we saw occur there in December. So that was really the laser focus, was to find a way to get the fighting stopped. So let me leave it there, Alex.
John, you want to add anything?
Yeah, and I would just underline Ambassador Booth's point there. I mean, above all else, saving lives is paramount in a situation like this, and there was a lot of very justifiable focus on ending violence in those early days, and that's part of why the UPDF intervention was appreciated and was, in a limited way, helpful. The problem is it just went way beyond that very quickly. Just to say a few more words about the sort of counterfactuals that you're asking about, Ali. In 2013, I think the alternative is some sort of really concerted mediation effort within the SPLM, within the party, and in some ways that was what was being asked for by some. Could the U.S. have done that, given the history and relationships? Maybe, but that's also sort of a bullying role in some ways for the U.S. So the other alternative is, could another entity, and here we get to the ANC from South Africa or CCM from Tanzania, which also have long party-to-party relationships with the SPLM, could they have been encouraged and supported to mount a more forceful mediation with the SPLM? And they were involved at the time. They weren't sitting it out, but could they have done more with U.S. support? I think those are the kind of counterfactual scenarios that are worth considering. And the fact that there weren't people in some of the senior positions at that time, as I mentioned, I think really did hurt in terms of ginning up the process within the U.S. government to mount that kind of intervention, whether it was us or a sort of bank shot with somebody else. On the UPDF intervention, I think I talked about the sort of counterfactuals in terms of how we manage our relationship with Uganda. I think on the arms embargo, it's a pretty clear one. Do it. I think 2016 is more tricky, but I do come back to the fact, particularly when it all fell apart the second time, and you have proven beyond a doubt that Salva and Riek can't coexist, and you have the attempt to assassinate First Vice President, co-signatory to the peace agreement. I think that is really where you go down the road of we need new leadership and a more forceful exploration of that idea.
Okay, thanks, John. Let's go to the floor. And just a reminder, please be concise. Please tell us who you are, and please ask a question. So there are mics available. Just wait for the mic. Yeah.
Yeah, my name is Gordon Boy. I'm the Chargé of the Republic of South Sudan in Washington. So my question will be to John. I read the book, but there is a part that John did not elaborate. That part is in 2014, 2015, I don't think people like Susan Rice, the Obama administration, would impose army embargo knowing quite well that the Sudan government was supporting the rebels. Because we went to war with Sudan in 2012, and that one is obvious. So if you put yourself in the shoes of people within the Obama administration like Susan Rice, who invested emotionally on South Sudan, for them to say that, okay, let's impose army embargo, that would encourage the enemies of the South Sudan in the region to destabilize more I don't think they would have done that. But the current army embargo is not effective because we now signed an agreement with Sudan, and Sudan is not any longer arming the rebels. I believe Ambassador Booth would even witness that. So it has no effect, because if you want to end the war, you have to, and if the army embargo is intended to end the war on both sides, but in reality the army embargo is targeting the government. It doesn't target the rebels, because the rebels are supported by the neighboring countries that are against the South. But currently, even if this multilateral army embargo imposed, it has no effect on the ground, because there is the regional dynamic within the region. For example, we signed agreements with Sudan government in June that changed a lot of things. Like what Kate was saying, that we signed an agreement with Sudan to come back for the oil exploration and things. The reason why we did that is because you need the two countries to cooperate to stop the rebels' activities, because the oil wells are along the border. So if Sudan is involved, it means that Sudan will not support South Sudan rebels, knowing that it would stop the flow of the oil. So this is what you did not elaborate in your study.
Okay, thank you. There was a gentleman in the second row there.
Just want to give thanks to John for presenting this summary. It covers most of the whole history of what is going on in South Sudan. I just want to thank you, and we'll definitely share this across our diversity to make sure that they get the message and the summary of what you have done. I just want to commend Kate for what she have just mentioned about the government of technocrats. If you look through all the documents that South Sudan Opposition Alliance, I represent NDM in the South Sudan Opposition Alliance. If you look at the summary that the Opposition Alliance has given, they gave a recommendation that all the Opposition Alliance plus the government will stay out, and we form a government of technocrats, neutral body that can create an environment for the South Sudanese to move forward. But none of the decision makers buy that idea. I'm one of the people who goes to office of Ambassador Booth every single week when he was in the office. And the recommendations that you have just Kate mentioned here is what we have shared with Ambassador Booth multiple times, that reinstating Salva Kiir and Riek Machar back to the office is basically a recipe for another cycle of violence. And this is at a personal level. I'm not speaking on behalf of the alliance now. I can make my own remarks. That at a personal level, those who think that Salva Kiir and Riek Machar will still be legitimate government, which we believe is no longer legitimate, eventually they will fail for the third time. I'm pretty much sure that having two vice presidents and then another, and then five vice presidents is not going to help. The final point, I agree with John that the United States of America need to make a decision that is very clear and in the benefit of the people of South Sudan, and not necessarily the governments and people who are trying to politicize the whole thing. We need to stop the bloodshed and really make a decision that I believe is being covered on this summary as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Ambassador Fee, I think you had something you wanted to say.
Hi, good morning. My name is Molly Fee, and I served as the U.S. Ambassador to South Sudan from 2015 to 2017. And I want to thank USIP and John and the panel for this discussion. I know so many of us in this room and listening care deeply about the situation there, and this is an important discussion. Unfortunately, I didn't have the opportunity to talk to John. Given our current state, and as I'm sort of one of the last senior Foreign Service officers standing in the Titanic, I think it's important to mention that, John, you talk about an absence of leadership at the envoy level, which we are now critically experiencing, and at the assistant secretary level, but you don't mention ambassadors or the diplomatic teams on the ground. I have two of the best officers I've ever known in the Foreign Service sitting in this audience today. So during a critical period from 2014 through 2015, we didn't have representation in Juba, and then last year, from 2017 to 2018, we didn't have a representative in Juba. And I do think diplomats matter. So sorry for standing on my soapbox. I want to pull up and just make 4 general points to pull from this. You and Ambassador Booth talk about the important conundrum where the government feels absolutely that we are hostile to it, and yet, John, you argue compellingly that there is a suggestion of facts that could be interpreted to suggest that we've been pro-government. I think my presumption is, they never talked to me directly about it, is that the senior principals in the Obama administration were dealing with a lot of challenges across the globe, and they were dealing with broken states in a lot of places. And there's a real reluctance, whether it's the Obama administration, the US government, or any foreign government, to sort of walk away from an existing government structure. There were many other governments, Japan is one of them, Germany is another, which felt that we were unrealistic, that this was the government that we had to work with them, and we had to make it work. So ultimately, my conclusion is that the government was creating this situation and that it wasn't workable. But I want you to know that there are, I think, legitimate debates along that line. You have to sort of work with what you have, and that's something that folks will have to consider in future conflicts. Secondly, in your 4 areas where we could reconsider, I think the issue of the agreement, which has been brought out in this discussion, and so how we get sort of hooked into a process. And Ali, I think you and I, there were several points where we saw when we were working so hard to implement the agreement that there were just some very loud warning signals that it didn't seem like it could work despite every effort. And should we have pulled back at some of those signposts? We can talk about that separately. But everybody gets invested in making the agreement work, and it's hard to step back and say, let's walk away from this process. There's a real attraction to a process. Also, I think it's important to note, which you can't get if you're doing this externally, is sort of how fluid the situation was. And there were many points when in both camps, they really wanted peace and they really tried to make it happen. And then it would get overruled. So it's hard to say it was fixed. And I think that fluid nature and dynamic nature of the environment is really important. And then lastly, on the issue of the region, I know there was some discussion in your paper, and I remember there was discussion in Washington, should we do some sort of Dayton-like prospect for the SPLM or the leadership? I wonder if we could have considered some sort of Dayton-like process for the region. It is true that Secretary Kerry went out and made an effort. It is true that President Obama went out for that meeting in Addis. But this is a group of damaged, broken people who don't know how to move forward. So would a more sustained effort involving the region have been helpful? I think that's a question to add to your questions. And then lastly, I think, and I know, John, you feel about this passionately, so I just want to emphasize this for you. The people of South Sudan, let's never forget what they think, and I think it's pretty demonstrable what they think of their leadership. So thanks very much for letting me offer those thoughts.
Thank you, Molly. We'll take one more from this side of the room, so the lady in the front here.
Hello, Nicole Wittersheim, recently retired NSC Africa Director. Started working in South Sudan in 1998. Thank you for your work, John, and everybody's efforts. This is obviously a super timely discussion. One thing I hear missing, and I haven't read the report cover to cover, is as a student of mass atrocities, you also look to see, not only with arms and weapons, how you take away the means by which to commit, that the parties who are committing the violence continue to commit the violence. And I'm wondering if this was just assumed in the absence of nation building, or if anybody raised pivotal moments where we could have talked about the financial means that the government, the key perpetrators of violence against civilians had their keys to the central bank, they had keys, they had the means by which to continue to use the oil wealth. And so it's a thing we've been focusing on now. I wonder in 2013 if there were moments, we see this repeated over and over and over again in Africa, where warring parties dig in to hold their power because they have access to all of the country's wealth. And then it also keeps their patronage network alive, and it keeps them willing to continue to fight an unwinnable war. So were there moments where we could have talked about not only arms and weapons, but also the financial means that kept the mass atrocities? And if there were in 2013, and I know Ambassador Booth has experience of this in Liberia, why didn't we do it? And I know it's a difficult thing, it's a sovereignty issue, but it's still front and center, and the money continues to flow. Thanks.
Thanks, Nicole. And let me just add one from the online audience, which you also touched on in your report, John, about Jonglei. To what extent did focus on the Jonglei crisis in mid-2013 distract the U.S. Embassy in Juba and D.C. counterparts from the warning signs within the SPLM at the time? And maybe, Don, if I can also ask you to respond to that, if you wouldn't mind. So, John, maybe we start with you. We have a few different questions for you.
No, a bunch of really good questions, and I very much appreciate them. Let me start on the arms embargo question, and I respectfully disagree. Part of the argument within the U.S. government for not doing an arms embargo was that it disproportionately harms the government. But I think the response to that is that there are things that can be done to balance that out if you want to. There are if the opposition is getting their arms through less formal channels, there are things, not perfect, but things you can do to limit those channels. And so I think the argument that it's a one-sided action does not need to be the case. You can balance that out. But I didn't see a lot of effort to do that. I think that gets to a larger point about what is an arms embargo in terms of a tool for limiting arms versus a signaling mechanism, and it's both. And let's not dismiss one or the other. Limiting the arms is absolutely critical, but it is just important to show international determination and to message to those who are seeking the arms. And that latter point, I think, was missed in some of the discussion. Just to Ambassador Fee's points, I would associate myself with them all. And I would particularly emphasize the point about the value of diplomacy in so much of what we do, and in this context in particular. And I think it's a really good point about the gap in ambassadors we had there, probably one I should have included as I think about that now. So thank you for that point. On Nicole's good question, I mean, that you alluded to it, but that really gets, for me, to the question of some sort of oversight mechanism, some sort of international mechanism that I think should have been in place from the beginning. And this is where I get back to the discussion of well, could the CPA have cooked some of this stuff into it? Or even during the interim period, could there have been some anticipation of these problems? And as 2011 approached, could there have been conversations about putting these sort of mechanisms in place? GMAP is the model that so many refer to. I know Ambassador Booth has thoughts on that will be valuable for us all. Whether it's GMAP or something else, there could have been ways to explore that. An oil escrow account is another option. But I just don't think there was a lot of consideration of that. I don't think there was a ton of muscle put behind trying to make that happen. And then on Jonglei, there is discussion of that in the report. I didn't have time to talk about it in my presentation. And there was a very strong U.S. government focus on response to Jonglei, and a very high level of alarm within the U.S. government as to what was going on there. And it was absolutely atrocious what was going on. And I do have people in my report quoted saying that distracted us from paying attention to the political dynamics within the SPLM that were so central to breaking things late in 2013. I have a hard time sort of finding the balance between whether that, was a negative distraction or a necessary distraction. I'm not quite sure where I come down on that, because a lot of people were dying in Jonglei. But I do think it is the case that attention was split between that and what was going on within the party.
Thanks, John. Just to add to Nicole's point about the economic issue, it's worth noting that the first draft, or the zero draft of the peace agreement of 2015 had a very much a GMAP model of financial arrangements, but some people didn't like it. So Kate.
I'm going to resist the urge to speak about these oversight mechanisms, because I think there is a lot more that we could and should have done even in the interim period and planned for in the post-independence period. That's a key error of the CPA timeframe, I don't think it was the job of the CPA per se to do that, but I think our role as the lead donor for South Sudan should have devised a different pathway through that interim period and into independence in terms of the resources that we invested as the United States of America in the project of an independent South Sudan. But I do want to just leave one critical point, which is we're missing the forest for the trees, right? Our policy has failed. We have not stopped the war. It's been 5+ years, and since 2015, and the last attempt at this power-sharing arrangement between Salva Kiir and Riek Machar, the conflict has spread across the entire country, and we have a humanitarian catastrophe that is of the worst in the world and the costliest to the United States of America in terms of our resources, but more importantly, the costliest in terms of lives lost. And so far, we can't even know how many lives have been lost. I know there's work being done on a mortality estimate. It's critically important for us to understand the magnitude of this. And when we miss and get these fundamental decisions wrong on political settlements, there are real ramifications to that. And I know it pains many of us in the room that this situation continues today, but we have not succeeded here. And these debates that we have over this decision, the net effect of all of that is that hundreds of thousands of lives have been lost in South Sudan, and we have not yet abated that.
Josh.
Yeah, I'll just quickly pick up on a point that Ambassador McPhee made. Yeah, diplomats absolutely matter. I still think this idea that, well, if we'd had more high-level meetings or certain diplomats in place, it would have shifted the conflict or would have made a difference. Maybe from my perspective, maybe in the very beginning of the conflict, but these men who have led this fight hardened their positions very early on. They may have been hardened from the very beginning. Diplomats are important. They're not omnipotent. So if they can't force someone to change their mind. So I think at that point, we should have moved very quickly to coercive diplomacy, extract a price for continuing this war. Or the other option is force, which wasn't an option. South Sudan doesn't rise to the U.S. national interest to actually send troops there, or anyone else really besides Uganda, I guess. But so I think that the fundamental assessment that has to be made is, are the interlocutors for peace actually committed to peace? Rule 1 of the USIP mediation book. And throughout this conflict, they haven't been. And so that should give us pause about how we proceed.
Don.
Okay, a lot of things to address here. First, let me start, Josh, with the idea of the coercive diplomacy. I'm really struck by the difference between my experience in putting Liberia sanctions against Charles Taylor and his supporters in place in the around 2000, with the process that we had to go through to get a handful of South Sudanese on a sanctions list. In the Liberia case, we got close to 50 people on a list in probably less than a week. In the South Sudan case, everyone seemed to require a high-level meeting and a paperwork process to justify everything so that it would be legally defensible in a U.S. court. So there's a bit of a process problem there. There's a bit of a broken system to that. I think we need to be careful. And Kate, I hear you that trying other things is definitely worthwhile. But we can't assume that if we had done something differently, somehow this war would be over now. I think that's a very dangerous assumption to make. On the technocratic government idea, that's great. I mean, some problems are solved that way, and we've seen this. Italy got through its economic crisis by having a technocratic government put in place for a while. But in South Sudan, who is going to put it in power? Was the SPLA, was the NIS, were all the other armed actors there going to suddenly let technocrats come in and run the country? I don't see how that was ever in the cards. So again, a great idea. The theory might be great, but the practicality is something you need to take into account. In terms of the warning signs, I think those warning signs really were seen in 2013. I think that's why Gail Smith, for example, went out to Juba twice in the summer of 2013. We have to also recognize that it wasn't just Jonglei that was a bit of a distraction from what was happening in the SPLM, but it was also Abyei deciding to have its unilateral referendum. And the very great fear that depending on how that went and how Khartoum and Juba reacted, we could very well have had another Sudan-South Sudan war, as occurred in 2012. I think we forget sometimes some of the things we actually did succeed in heading off. So the warning signs were seen, and certainly it was the topic of my 2 visits pre-conflict to South Sudan. It was certainly something that Ambassador Page and her team on the ground engaged in consistently in the messaging, but the South Sudanese leaders were not really willing to listen to that. Going after the money, Nicole, even before I became envoy, when I was ambassador in Addis, Ambassador Page and Special Envoy Lyman came to see me to talk about GMAP and what was involved and how did we get it and how did it work. And at the end of about a 4-hour discussion of this, they both concluded that there was no way the South Sudanese would ever accept this. Again, we have to keep in mind that the mentality of South Sudanese leaders is we won what we got and we're now going to enjoy it. And anybody who gets in our way is against us, and we'll fight them. And I'm reminded often of a quote when South Sudan cut off its own oil production back in 2012. And the SPLM leaders said, "We lived in the bush for 40 years eating snakes, we can go do it again." Most of us didn't really believe that these guys wearing their expensive suits really were going to do that. But there was that mentality, that bluster of, we won this, so there's only so far we're going to let you, our good friends, push us around. We also, as Ali said, pushed very hard for a robust economic chapter in the peace agreement. We frankly got zero support from the AU5 or EGAD on that. Quite understandably, none of those states would have wanted us proposing similar things to them. And frankly, there was even a bit of a tepid support for it among the international financial institutions and some of our Western friends because of the practicalities of it. Liberia was a unique case, and even there, the implementation of it had its great flaws. We also pushed very hard for something on an oil escrow. And we worked very hard with the Chinese, and at one point it looked like we were making some progress with the Chinese on that. There was an openness to even talking about it. But at the end of the day, they weren't willing to cooperate. And there was no way that we could see with the convoluted system where South Sudan produced the oil, but it was exported through Sudan. The origin of it, by the time it got to Port Sudan, was completely unknown. What was Sudanese oil, what was South Sudanese oil, without the cooperation of the Chinese, who were the major purchasers and the major producers of it. But that was tried. And then on the arms embargo, let me just say, one of the concerns we had was whether it would be effective. And just like supporting a negotiation that goes nowhere tends to have an effect on your credibility, putting an arms embargo out that has no impact also erodes credibility. So that, I think, was a legitimate consideration. There were certainly others, but that was one of them.
Thanks, Don. I know we're running out of time, but if Nicoletta will permit me to have one very brief last round, very quickly, and at least we'll give John the right to answer, if not everyone, but we'll take a couple from this side here. So the gentleman here.
Hi, my name is Tom. I'm here on behalf of Nonviolent Peace Force. Yep, this is better. I'm here on behalf of Nonviolent Peace Force, an international organization that has worked on the ground in South Sudan since 2010, employing 170 unarmed civilian protectors in 15 regions around South Sudan to help build up the local civilian society. And this question is primarily directed towards Ambassador Booth and Joshua. Ambassador Booth, you posed an excellent question. What mass atrocity has been solved by intervention? And Joshua, you spoke about the South Sudanese people and their desire for peace. And I'm just wondering, both of your perspectives on how can we build up the capacity for local civil societies to stop the violence.
Thanks. And the last one, yes, yeah.
All right, thank you so much for the opportunity. I'm Nathaniel Nyok, a Sudanese activist here in Washington. Honorable Booth, thank you so much for having a clear understanding of what is happening in South Sudan. I think for the international community to get a quality policy on how to address this situation in South Sudan, they need to also understand the political culture and heritage in South Sudan. So my question would be, in December last year, the parties to the conflict signed a cessation of hostilities in Addis Ababa. The U.S. did not initial it. In June this year, the parties to the conflict also agreed on security arrangement in Khartoum, Sudan. The U.S. did not initial it. So what was the message to the warring parties? Was this a bad peace? I mean, it was a bad way to peace. What would be the best way? Also, had the push to push out President Kiir out of power succeeded, what would have been the mechanism or possibility, or even the precedent, of removing a sitting president of a sovereign state? And would you still recommend the same option today? Would it be a possibility with the current administration? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Don, can I just ask you to respond to those if you will, and any concluding thoughts?
Sure. On the role of local civil society, John and I have had this discussion a lot about sort of can you get to peace from the grassroots, and we've agreed that building understanding at the grassroots level is very helpful in getting to peace, particularly in getting to something that will be sustained. There are two problems. One is it's a very slow process. It's probably a generational process, and you don't want the conflict to go on for a generation trying to get the bottom up to get it solved. And secondly was anytime any part of civil society got too high a profile, the government either tended to squash them or co-opt them. When the U.S. brought a very large civil society delegation, women's groups, religious groups, leaders, etc., to Addis to try to figure out a way to get them inserted into the peace process in March of 2014. At the end of our week-long conference and workshops, etc., many of them expressed fear about going home. And the Ethiopians said, don't even think about staying here on asylum. You came here for a specific purpose. You're going home. They did. And a year later, my understanding from our embassy was that well over half of them, of the people who participated in that, were working for the government. They had been co-opted. So, if you get civil society to raise its head too high, it can either get chopped off or yanked down. And that's unfortunately, I think, not unique to South Sudan. I think we've seen that in many other places. In terms of U.S. support for the recent ceasefires, I can't speak for the current administration. My understanding is there have been many public statements that have been put out by the State Department, either as the U.S. or as part of a troika, very much supporting the ceasefires and urging the parties to implement them. So I don't think there's a signal by any means by us not initialing them. I mean, they weren't negotiated by us, that somehow we don't support them. The public statements are very clear on that.
Thanks, Don. Josh, civil society.
Yeah. Well, it's really tough, obviously, and excuse me. I think one way is, and this is a broader point, I think, or a broad approach we should be taking, is that we should be thinking less about Juba and more about the peripheries, and sending less of our, or focusing less of our aid operations, for instance, out of Juba, things of that nature, and thinking more creatively about how can we get directly to the people. And yeah, I absolutely, I'm sure that those challenges that Don identified are very real. But the SPLA doesn't control the entire country, and there are clearly sort of pockets of opportunity, I think. There's some interesting work being done on trying to revive local markets, for instance. These are all small initiatives, they're pinpricks, but given how terribly this conflict has gone and how there seems to just be no viable path forward, we do need to think creatively, and maybe the small stuff is the best we can do right now.
Thanks. Kate?
Let's be clear. President Salva Kiir is a leader who has failed his people. 97% of the citizens of Juba, the capital city, do not eat more than one meal a day. The state has utterly failed, and the leadership has utterly failed, and it is incumbent upon both Salva Kiir and Riek Machar to step aside. That is what leaders are supposed to do when they have failed to deliver the mandate that they were put in place to do. He's not the head of state for life. He is not the sovereignty of South Sudan. The people are the sovereignty of South Sudan. And thus far, we have all failed to move the situation to a place where that can be protected for the enduring future of South Sudan. That is the critical point.
Let me just make one final point, building off of the good civil society discussion in the last few minutes, which is that I think, and have thought for a while, there really do need to be two simultaneous conversations going on here. One is about how to end the violence and end so much of the suffering that Kate and others have discussed. The other one is about generational change and what is the 20-year plan for South Sudan. And that's a conversation for South Sudanese, and I think that we in the West and others can support and assist and prod and so forth, but it's a conversation for South Sudan. But that conversation, and it's happening in some ways, but I feel like it has to happen on a much larger scale, in a much more concerted fashion, and it has to be much more front and center, because it is hard to see the current generation of leadership making any of the reforms that are necessary, or even stepping aside as much as they really should. There has to be that conversation. It has to start now. If you wait for that conversation, then 20 years is always 20 years away. But I feel like there's great need for that investment now. There has been for a few years now, and that is really. I don't have a lot of solutions for the political peace process right now. That is my firmest belief at this point.
Well, thank you, John, and thank you to all of you for your comments and thoughts. And I think John's been very modest in encouraging you to read the report. So we'll be his cheerleaders and say, read this report, because of all the things written about South Sudan, this is actually a very reflective piece that is very helpful. There's a lot that's written, and this is something that everyone who's interested in the country, but also in the policy-making process beyond South Sudan, I think can learn something from. So please do read the report. I see Molly is here. Yes. Okay.
Sure. Just very quickly, just for the panel, I wanted to ask, sort of, in terms of, this was somewhat raised in John's report, but the cost of maintaining humanitarian access and diplomatic presence in South Sudan, that was obviously a huge consideration. So I just wanted to ask the panel, what your thoughts are on, because these discussions were also ongoing about how worth it is it to us to stay in country to provide this life-saving humanitarian assistance, to maintain our diplomatic presence there, because a lot of these different kind of counterfactuals and different paths we could have taken would have had repercussions for our ability to maintain that humanitarian access and our presence there on the ground. And that's certainly true for us, but it was also true for other countries. It was true for humanitarians. It was true for UNMISS. So I was just curious for people's thoughts on that.
It's a very good question. I don't know if we have the time to answer it, but I do know that everyone who's to the left and right of me has a view on this question. Quite elaborate views, I would say, also. So please do seek them out, and I'm sure they'll be happy to tell you their views. But again, let me please join me in thanking all the speakers for their contributions today.